things that finally made sense after 60. A quiet Buddhist letter to my younger self. There comes a time not marked on any calendar, not celebrated with candles or milestones, when the soul begins to stir beneath the noise. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't announce itself in capital letters. It comes gently, almost invisibly, like sunlight slipping across a floor you've walked 1,000 times but never truly noticed. Mine came on a Tuesday, a quiet one, the kind of day you forget unless something unforgettable happens. And something did, not outside me but within. I was folding laundry, alone in my small kitchen. The kettle was murmuring. The house was still. And out of that stillness, a single sentence rose like a whisper from the center of my chest, a truth I had buried beneath decades of striving. You didn't need to try so hard to be loved. That one thought undid something in me, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a thread gently loosening at the edge of a well-worn life. It wasn't enlightenment, it wasn't even clarity. It was the beginning of softness. And in that softness, I met myself for the very first time, not as someone becoming, not as someone performing, but simply as I was. Here, now, still. This video is not a sermon. It's not a checklist for self-improvement. It's not content you consume while distracted. It's something else entirely, a sacred pause. A chance to sit beside someone who's walked through grief, through silence, through the long, aching wilderness of not enough, and come out the other side with nothing to prove but everything to share. So I ask you, not as a stranger but as a fellow traveler, stay. Watch until the end. Let your mind grow quiet and your heart honest. Because in these next few minutes I will not give you answers, but I will offer you something far more rare: company. And in that company, perhaps you'll hear the soft voice inside yourself that has waited patiently for years to be heard. If something in you leans in right now, if some forgotten part of you exhales, then don't let this be the last moment we share. Subscribe to this channel, not because algorithms asked you to, but because your soul did. Because deep down, you know, wisdom like this isn't loud, it's quiet. And in a world that never stops shouting, we need quiet more than ever. So take a breath. You're safe here. Let us begin. Quiet truth 1. You were never meant to be useful, you were meant to be real. There was a season in my life, maybe you've lived through one too, when I believed I had to earn my place by giving everything I had. I called it love. I called it kindness. I told myself I was generous. But beneath it all, if I'm being completely honest, was fear. Fear that if I stopped giving, people would leave. That if I stopped being useful, I'd be forgotten. So I became smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I cooked. I listened. I nodded when I wanted to cry. I smiled even harder when no one noticed I was hurting. That's the strange thing. We learn how to disappear, piece by piece, while telling ourselves we're just being good. But at some point, I started to feel the weight of that disappearing. Not like a tragedy, but like a quiet erosion. The kind that makes you wake up in the middle of the night and ask, who am I when no one needs me? I think the Buddha knew about this erosion. He spoke of it not in terms of heartbreak or burnout, but in the language of truth and awakening. Your work, he once said, is to discover your work and then, with all your heart, give yourself to it. But what if your work is not your job, not your title, not what others expect of you? What if your deepest work is simply learning to be with yourself? Not fixing, not achieving, just being real and raw and present. These days, I often sit by the window in the afternoon. A cup of tea warms my hands. The steam curls into the air like a quiet prayer, and I watch the leaves move outside, soft, slow, without urgency. In that stillness, I realize I spent so much of my life trying to justify my place in the world, And all along I was already enough. You were never meant to be useful. You were meant to be real. Realness isn't glamorous. It's not always easy, but it's sacred. It means showing up as yourself, not who others want you to be, not who your past shaped you into. Just you in this breath, in this moment. The world will always ask for more help, more patience, more sacrifice. But at some point we must pause and ask, is what I'm giving coming from love or from fear? And if it's fear, can I choose a different way? In Buddhist teachings, there's something called right effort. Not frantic effort, not people-pleasing effort. Right effort. The kind of energy that is balanced, steady, and aligned with truth. It reminds us that burning ourselves out is not compassion, that we can be kind without disappearing. Have you ever poured tea for someone else but forgotten to pour a cup for yourself? That's how many of us live. Giving, giving, giving until our cup is empty. And we wonder why we feel invisible. Why we feel tired even after a full night's sleep. It's not sleep we need, it's presence. It's self-compassion. It's the courage to say, I matter too. There is a Buddhist story about a woman named Kisa Gautami who lost her child and begged the Buddha to bring him back. He told her to bring a mustard seed from any home that had never known loss. She searched every home and found sorrow at each door. When she returned, she hadn't found the seed, but she had found understanding. Her pain was no longer isolated, it was human. I think of that story often, because sometimes what we carry as overgiving is actually grief. Grief for being unseen. Grief for the years we gave everything away in the name of love, and were never asked if we had anything left. But like Kisa, healing doesn't come from doing more. It comes from seeing clearly, from knowing, I am not the only one. And I am not alone. The practice of loving kindness, metta, begins with this truth, that we must include ourselves in the circle of care. That saying no can be holy. That sitting still is not a waste of time, it is a homecoming. Sometimes I place my hand on my heart and whisper, may I be safe, may I be well, may I be at ease. It feels strange at first, like I'm talking to someone else. But then I remember, that someone is me, the one I've abandoned, the one I've overworked, the one I'm now learning to cherish. And real presence begins to return, not in the form of applause, not in the form of productivity, but in a breath, a slow, honest breath. The kind that doesn't try to change anything, just acknowledges that being here is enough. The mountain does not apologize for standing still. The flower does not beg to be useful. Why should you? You are not here to prove your worth. You are here to remember it. This is what the Dharma whispers to us in quiet moments. You are enough, not because of what you give, but because of who you are when you stop giving. Because of who you are when you sit down at the table with your own soul. So maybe today, don't rush to fix anything. Don't run to answer every call. Maybe just pour yourself a cup of tea, sit by the window, and ask gently, if I stop trying to be useful for a moment, who might I finally meet? Quiet truth 2. Love that demands you to shrink is not love, it's conditioning. There's a kind of love that makes you tiptoe through your own life, not because you are fragile, but because you've been made to feel that your full presence might be too much for someone else to handle. So you tuck parts of yourself away. You soften your opinions. You dim your joy just enough so that it won't draw too much attention. You hold your breath in your own home. I know that kind of love. Many of us do. It's the kind of love that arrives with conditions written in invisible ink, spoken not in words, but in glances, silence, withdrawal. You learn over time what is allowed and what is too much. You learn what part of yourself is acceptable and what needs to go underground. And if you grew up like I did, in a family where love was measured in usefulness, in obedience, in how much you could endure without complaint, You might confuse love with survival. But there is a teaching in Buddhism that returns to me often, a teaching I hold like a smooth stone in my hand. Whatever has the nature to arise also has the nature to cease, including the kind of love that asks you to disappear, including the fear that if you are fully yourself, you'll be left behind, including the idea that you must earn the right to belong. We carry these beliefs deep in the body, not because they are true, but because we were too young to question them when we first learned them. And so we inherited not just the stories of our family, but the unspoken rules about who we're allowed to be. Do you know the story of Kisa Gautami? She was a young woman in the time of the Buddha. Her child died suddenly, and her grief was so overwhelming that she wandered from house to house, carrying her baby in her arms, begging anyone for a medicine that would bring him back to life. Finally, someone sent her to the Buddha, and the Buddha told her he could make her a medicine, but only if she could bring him a mustard seed from a household that had never known death. She searched, of course, but every door she knocked on, every home she entered had its own story of loss. A mother, a father, a child, a husband, every family had its own grief. Eventually, Kisa Gautami understood. She placed her child's body down, and she returned to the Buddha, not with a mustard seed, but with eyes opened by compassion for herself and for the human condition. What does this story have to do with love? Everything. Because most of us go through life like Kisa, thinking we are the only ones who feel unseen, unloved, forgotten. We think we are the only ones holding grief, shame, or a lifetime of shrinking ourselves to fit the expectations of others. But when you begin to truly listen, to sit quietly with others and hear what rests beneath their stories, you realize we've all been told in some way that we are only lovable if we are less loud, less emotional, less opinionated, less inconvenient, less alive. And once you see that, once you really see that, you can begin to place down what was never yours to carry. There's a tree outside my window. I watch it every morning as I drink tea. It never apologizes for taking up space. It never worries that its leaves are too bright or its branches too wide. It simply grows, rooted, reaching, bending when needed but never shrinking. That tree is no more or less deserving of sunlight because of how neat or tidy it appears. And neither are you. You don't have to earn belonging. You are belonging. You don't have to become smaller to be loved. Real love, true, conscious, sacred love, expands to meet you where you are. I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me earlier. You don't have to prove your worth through exhaustion. You don't have to rescue everyone from their discomfort. You don't have to abandon yourself in the name of harmony. The Buddha taught that liberation doesn't come from escaping the world, but from seeing it clearly. And that includes seeing clearly when a relationship is not rooted in love, but in control. When the bond is kept alive not by mutual growth, but by one person's silence. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is to stop playing the role they've written for you. Because here's the thing about conditioning. It only has power when it's unconscious. The moment you see it, name it, sit with it, it begins to unravel. Like a tight knot in a shoelace, it takes time, patience, tender hands, but it does loosen. It does give. So if you've spent years in a marriage, a friendship, a family, where your truth felt like an inconvenience, please know, you are not broken. You were simply told a story that isn't yours, and you are allowed to stop playing along. Even if your voice shakes, even if they don't understand, even if you have to sit alone for a while, learning the sound of your own breathing again. Because the freedom that comes from being real, truly real, is worth every silent dinner, every misunderstanding, every moment you choose yourself without apology. There's another teaching I love. Let go of what does not serve, and the path will appear. You don't have to know what comes next. You don't need a 5-year plan for your healing. All you need is the willingness to stop abandoning yourself. And in that space, the space between who you were told to be and who you actually are, something sacred begins to bloom. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's like light moving across the floor in the late afternoon, like breath finally coming all the way down into the belly, like a long-held sadness exhaling itself into peace. So today, just notice. Notice when you feel yourself folding in. Notice when you smile to make others comfortable. Notice when your yes feels more like a quiet betrayal. And ask yourself gently, what would love do if it did not require me to disappear? Quiet truth 3. You don't need closure, you need clarity. There are some pains that age with us, not like wisdom, but like unopened letters. They sit quietly in the drawer of memory, sealed with silence, stamped with questions we were never brave enough to ask out loud. Or maybe we did ask once, but no one ever answered. And so we held onto the waiting for years, sometimes decades, believing that the right words, the perfect explanation, the long overdue apology would somehow ease the ache that had settled deep into our chest. I used to think closure meant someone returning to me, owning their mistake, saying sorry with eyes that understood the weight of what they had done. I imagined the moment again and again, the dramatic turning point, the release of emotion, the healing. But the truth I found was far more quiet. Life never delivered that moment. People moved on. Some forgot. Some rewrote the story to protect themselves from guilt. Some just disappeared. And I was left with my own heartbeat and a handful of questions that never stopped echoing through the stillness. That's when I started to understand. Clarity doesn't arrive wrapped in someone else's redemption. It comes slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. It comes the morning you no longer check your phone for messages that never came. It comes in the middle of folding laundry, when you realize you're no longer telling yourself the same old story about why they left. It comes when you catch your own reflection in the window, and for the first time, you don't look like someone waiting to be fixed. You look like someone who survived. Clarity isn't about getting answers. It's about releasing the need for them. It doesn't shout, it whispers, and its voice often sounds a lot like your own after a long walk in silence, when you finally stop blaming yourself for what was never in your control. There's a kind of peace that comes not from understanding why something happened, but from realizing you no longer need to understand it. It happened. It hurt. You lived. And now you can let it go. I remember one evening, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. The steam curled upwards into the soft light, and for a moment everything was still. No expectations, no rehearsed conversations. Just breath and warmth and a sense of being here. That was the first time I felt the wound loosening, not closing, but softening. I didn't get the closure I thought I needed, but I found something else. I found clarity. And in that moment, it was enough. You see, closure often disguises itself as justice. We think we need the other person to admit, to explain, to see us fully. But what we really crave isn't their words. It's our own permission to stop suffering. And you don't need anyone else's permission to do that. You can grant it yourself. In Buddhist thought, suffering ends not when the world becomes fair, but when our attachment to what we think should have been is released. The pain is real, but the suffering, the ongoing spiral of thought, the reliving of the past, that is optional. And it ends when we begin to live fully in what is, not what was. There's a story I once heard of a monk who carried a heavy bucket of water up a long hill. When asked why he didn't set it down, he said, "I didn't realize I was still holding it." That's how it is with grief, resentment, old questions. Sometimes we carry them so long they begin to feel like a part of us. But we are not our waiting. We are not our unanswered stories. We are the ones who breathe beyond them. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean what happened was okay. It simply means you're choosing your life over your pain. You're no longer asking the past to give you peace. You're making peace with the fact that it won't. There was a moment I remember, a quiet afternoon, not unlike this one. The sun came through the curtains and landed on the table beside me. I looked at the empty chair across from mine and realized I had been waiting for someone to return to that chair for far too long. Someone who, perhaps, was never coming. And instead of feeling sorrow, I felt something else rise, gratitude. Gratitude that I was still here. That I had the strength to sit with myself. That I had grown enough to know I didn't need them anymore to feel whole. If you are still holding the ache of something unfinished, I won't tell you to let it go. That's not my place. But I will sit here with you and remind you gently that you are not what they did to you. You are not the silence they left behind. You are not the story they refused to finish. You are the breath that continues, the softness that remains, the one who stays even after others leave. And maybe, just maybe, that is the only closure you will ever need. Or maybe you never needed closure at all. Maybe what you needed and still need is clarity. The kind that rises not from answers but from presence. The kind that doesn't demand explanations but honors the truth that you are still here, still living, still worthy. And so I leave you with this question, not to solve, but to live with. What might unfold in your life if you stopped waiting for closure and simply let yourself begin again? Quiet Truth 4. Solitude is a sanctuary, not a sentence. There was a time when I would have done anything not to be alone. I said yes to invitations I didn't want. I lingered in conversations that felt hollow. I stayed in places where my spirit no longer felt safe, simply because I feared what the silence might say if I left. I kept myself busy, not with joy but with noise. I feared the empty room, the still house, the long afternoon where the only sound was the ticking of a clock. I told myself that if I wasn't surrounded, I wasn't seen. And if I wasn't seen, I wasn't loved. But solitude, my dear, isn't the absence of love. It's often the place where the deepest love begins to speak. In my 60s, when the rush of proving and pleasing began to soften, I found myself in a kind of quiet I hadn't known before. It wasn't the quiet of being ignored. It was the quiet of no longer needing to explain myself. It was the soft hum of being home with myself. At first, it startled me. I'd open the curtains wide, just to let the light in, as if light alone could fill the spaces left behind by years of striving. I'd turn on the radio for background sound, boil water just to hear it whistle, check the mailbox even when I knew it was empty. That old reflex to reach outside of myself still lingered. But then something began to shift. I remember one morning. The sunlight came through the window, slow and golden, spilling across the wooden floor like a soft promise. I made tea, jasmine, I think, and instead of taking it to the television or the phone, I sat down in silence. The mug warmed my hands. Steam rose gently in the air. The world outside was still, as if holding its breath. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt accompanied by something invisible and kind. A quiet presence, soft but steady, like an old friend who doesn't need to speak to make you feel safe. That was my soul. She hadn't left. She had just been waiting for me to slow down enough to notice her, to sit beside her and listen. You see, the world often tells us that solitude is punishment, that to be alone is to be left behind, especially for women, especially as we age. We're told to measure our worth by who needs us, who calls us, who chooses us. But the Dharma whispers something else. It tells us that the greatest companionship is the one we cultivate within. That stillness is not a void. It is a sanctuary. The Buddha often retreated to the forest, not to escape the world, but to remember who he was beyond it. There, among trees and silence and open skies, he met the truth of things. And we can too, not by leaving our lives, but by returning to our own breath, our own heartbeat, our own presence. There is a temple inside you, and it doesn't need crowds to be holy. It needs sincerity. It needs attention. It took me years to learn that I didn't have to fill every moment. That emptiness wasn't something to be feared but felt. That beneath the surface of loneliness, there is often a longing not for another, but for reunion with the self we abandoned trying to belong. And when we sit still long enough, that self begins to return. Not all at once. She comes in glances, in memories, in sudden waves of tenderness that wash over us without warning. She comes in the act of brushing your own hair with care, in the way you fold your towel just so, in the breath you take when no one is watching. She is you, and she's been so patient. Sometimes I light a candle in the evening not because anyone will see it, but because I will. I let the soft glow remind me I am worth gentleness, even when I am the only witness. I no longer confuse solitude with exile. I've learned that the quiet spaces of my life are where I've found the most truth, the most beauty, the most healing. I don't need to be needed to be worthy. I don't need to be busy to be alive. And if I ever start to forget, I return to the tea, the warmth, the silence, the way the steam rises like a prayer, because in that stillness I remember I am not waiting to be loved. I am being loved by the part of me I finally made room for. So if you too are walking through a season of quiet, I want you to know it's not a sentence. It's not a punishment. It's an invitation to meet yourself again, to sit beneath the old tree of your being and rest, to hear the breeze through the leaves and know you are not alone, you are with yourself, and that is sacred. Let this time be soft. Let it be holy. Let it be enough. And as you sit in your own company with nothing to prove, ask yourself, not for answers but for presence. What would happen if you treated your solitude not as something to escape, but as something to honor? Quiet Truth 5. You are not behind, you are becoming. Sometimes I sit by the window at dusk, watching the last of the daylight fall across the floor like silk. It's a quiet hour, not quite night, not fully day, and in that soft in-between, I often think of the word becoming. Not as a task, not as something to rush, but as a blooming, slow, quiet, and invisible to the eye until, suddenly, one day, it is unmistakably there. There have been moments in my life, more than I care to count, where I looked around and thought, I'm late. Late to success. Late to healing. Late to love. I watched others find their way, build their lives, take photos that seemed to hold everything I had not yet touched. And I whispered to myself in shame, you should be further along. But here's what I've come to understand. Now that I've had the gift of time, of silence, and of many quiet mornings spent with nothing but a cup of tea and the breath in my chest, there is no such thing as being behind when it comes to the soul. A tree does not rush its growth. The moon does not compete with the stars. And the lotus, one of the Buddha's most sacred symbols, only blooms when the water is still and warm enough to hold its becoming. There are reasons your path has unfolded the way it has, even if they don't make sense right now. Even if the ground feels shaky. Even if you still feel like you're waiting for the real life to begin. There's a teaching I once heard, quiet but unforgettable. The river does not ask how fast it's moving, it just flows. And perhaps our healing is like that too, not always visible, not always measurable, but always moving, always carving its way toward something true. When we compare, we forget. We forget that the journey inward is not a staircase, it's more like a spiral. You pass the same themes, the same questions, the same lessons again and again, but each time a little deeper, a little softer, a little wiser. Just because something returns doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you are revisiting it with new eyes. There were years I thought I'd lost time. That because I hadn't achieved certain things by a certain age, I had somehow failed. But no time spent listening to your soul is wasted. No season of rest, confusion, or gentle unfolding is a detour. It is the path itself. Sometimes we blossom late, not because we are flawed, but because we are layered, and deep things take longer to bloom. One afternoon, I was walking through a garden. It was early spring. Tulips were already out in full color, proud and bright. But there, nestled in the quiet shadow near the pond, was a single peony not yet open. Just a tight bud, green and waiting. At first I felt sad for it. Left behind, I thought. But then I remembered, the peony takes its time. And when it opens all at once, full, fragrant, unapologetically bold. It is not trying to match the tulips. It is being what it is, on its time, in its rhythm, in its truth. And so are you. The Buddha once said, if we could see the miracle of a single flower clearly, our whole life would change. I believe that. And I believe if we could see the miracle of our own becoming, the unseen strength it takes to stay when it's easier to run, to begin again after disappointment, to keep soft in a hard world, we would stop rushing. We would start honoring. You are not on anyone else's clock. You are not a project to be completed. You are a presence unfolding. There is no behind. There is only this moment, this breath, this becoming. And if the world tries to hurry you, let it pass like wind through trees. Let it go. You are not late. You are in bloom. And as you sit with that in the glow of your own quiet unfolding, I'll leave you with this. What if your pace was never a problem to fix, but a wisdom to trust? Quiet Truth 6. Spiritual growth looks like slowing down. Spiritual growth, for a long time, felt like a place I had to reach. A mountaintop I needed to climb, where the air was thin and holy, and I would somehow become someone more. I thought it would feel like light pouring through stained glass or incense curling upward in a perfect spiral, like something sacred and unmistakable. But the older I've become, the more I've come to understand, growth is not some grand achievement. It is not a new identity. It is a softening, a slowing, a returning. It's not found in long meditations under Bodhi trees or the chanting of ancient sutras alone. No, it is in the small and almost invisible shifts that happen in the middle of your ordinary life. It looks like the moment you pause before reacting to someone's harsh words. It's the breath you take before assuming the worst. The choice to sit with discomfort instead of numbing it with distraction. These small gestures, unnoticed by the world, are what carve the path of awakening. One day, I was in the kitchen with my granddaughter. She had spilled a bowl of rice on the floor. Years ago, I might have sighed, hurried to clean it up, or said something sharp without meaning to. But this time, I just knelt down beside her, picked up a few grains, and smiled. The floor was hungry too, I said softly. She laughed. And in that laugh, I felt something shift inside me, not because I had said something wise, but because I had chosen presence over irritation. That was the practice. That was the growth. Buddhism teaches us that mindfulness is not an escape from life, but a way of fully entering it. Not to bypass emotions, but to meet them with compassion. Slowing down is not a sign of weakness or laziness. It is strength refined. Because when you slow down, you notice. You notice the way sunlight filters through the curtains in the morning. You notice how your body tenses when you're about to speak from habit. You notice the ache in your chest that isn't sadness, just a part of you longing to be heard. Slowing down allows the sacred to catch up with you. In this society, Where speed is mistaken for worth, stillness becomes an act of rebellion, a return to our original rhythm. The breath, the step, the sip of tea, all of it becomes holy when we are awake for it. And grace, I've found, isn't in being untouched by life. It's in touching life gently, even when it bruises you. There's a story from the Zen tradition. A young monk once asked his master, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The monk frowned, "But master, isn't that what everyone does?" The teacher smiled, "No. Most people entertain 1,000 thoughts while eating and resist their weariness while sleeping. That is the difference. Spiritual growth is not about glowing in the dark. It's about being so deeply present in your own skin, in your own breath, in your own experience, that nothing is rejected and everything becomes part of the path, including your impatience, including your sorrow, including the parts of you still learning how to love. I've come to believe that true awakening isn't a lightning strike. It's more like a dawn that arrives so slowly. You only realize it's morning when the birds begin to sing. So if you're waiting for a sign that you're growing, look to your life. Are you gentler with yourself than you were a year ago? Are you choosing silence over proving your point? Are you giving your heart space to breathe instead of pushing it to perform? That is growth. That is sacred. And now, in this quiet moment between us, I'll leave you with this. What if the most spiritual thing you could do today was simply to slow down enough to hear the sound of your own soul whispering back to you? Quiet Truth 7. The universe speaks in whispers, not warnings. We often say we're waiting for a sign, as if the universe will suddenly shout from the heavens, shake the earth beneath our feet, send a letter in the mail, or a dream we can't forget. We imagine the truth will arrive loud and certain, like thunder cracking through the sky. But in my experience, that's not how life speaks. Not really. The universe, like a wise teacher, rarely raises its voice. It doesn't scold. It doesn't demand. Instead, it whispers. It nudges. It places a subtle knowing in the body long before the mind catches up. Have you noticed it? The feeling when you walk into a room and your shoulders instinctively tense, even though everyone is smiling. The catch in your throat when someone interrupts you again and you laugh along, even though it stings. The weight you feel in your chest after saying yes to something you didn't want, just to keep the peace. That discomfort is not random. That ache is not an accident. It's guidance, clear, precise, and deeply compassionate. I used to ignore those whispers. I thought they were weakness. I thought they were overreactions. I told myself I was being too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. But over time, I realized those soft, inner shifts were the soul's way of speaking before the world had to scream. And when I ignored them long enough, that's when life got loud, through illness, through burnout, through relationships falling apart. The Buddha once said, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought. The mind is everything." But the mind is not just logic and language, it's also feeling, sensation, vibration, wisdom that lives in the breath, the bones, the heartbeat that quickens when something is not aligned. We are not just thinkers, we are listeners. And to live well, we must become better at listening to what does not shout. There was a time when I kept trying to force clarity from life. I prayed for answers, pulled cards, asked friends, read books, searched the stars, when all along the answers were sitting beside me. In the quiet moments I kept rushing past. The stillness after I closed a door that should have stayed closed. The breath I held when someone called me selfish for setting boundaries. The lightness in my chest when I finally spent a whole afternoon alone without apologizing for it. Those were whispers, clear as temple bells, and they weren't just random feelings. They were my body remembering what peace felt like. They were truth returning home. In Buddhist practice, we often speak of mindfulness not as a technique, but as a way of returning to the moment, to sensation, to presence, not because the moment is perfect, but because it holds the only voice that never lies, the present one. When you are truly mindful, you don't just observe, you notice. And in noticing, you hear. I once heard a monk say, when the student is ready, the silence becomes a sermon. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I do. Now I know that the most sacred wisdom doesn't come in grand teachings or sacred texts, though those help. It comes when you are washing the dishes and suddenly feel a sadness you can't explain. It comes when you're walking beneath trees and the sunlight hits the leaves just so, and you realize you've been too hard on yourself lately. It comes when you're about to say yes out of habit and something inside you quietly says, you don't have to anymore. These are not just moments. They are messages. And the more we honor them, the more we realize we were never without guidance. We just didn't trust the softness of its form. So many of us have grown up believing wisdom must be harsh to be true. That change must be painful. That growth must feel like breaking apart. But what if that's not the only path? What if the universe, in its great compassion, has been trying all along to guide us gently, but we only listened when life got loud? There's a kind of reverence that grows when we start honoring the smallest signs. When we treat the clench in our belly not as inconvenience, but as sacred instruction. When we take seriously the tears that rise when no one else is watching. When we pause in front of a window, tea in hand, and feel that unspoken truth inside us gently unfolding. This is not what I want. Not anymore. There is no punishment in these whispers, no judgment, only clarity, only presence, only love in a softer shape. And now I wonder, what would shift in your life if you began to treat every whisper not as something to dismiss, but as something divine? Quiet Truth 8. Grief never leaves, but it changes shape. There are people I still talk to, not with words, not aloud, but in the way I fold towels the way they taught me. In the way I keep the window cracked just slightly, because that's how they liked it. There are days I make 2 cups of tea out of habit, only to remember there is no second hand reaching for the other. There are songs I avoid, not because they hurt, but because they open something too wide, too suddenly. And in that moment, I'm back there in the presence of someone I still love, who simply isn't here anymore. People often say, time heals all wounds. But in my experience, time just teaches you how to carry them differently. When someone you love leaves, whether through death, distance, or quiet disappearance, it doesn't vanish. It reshapes. The wound becomes a well, and though it may no longer bleed, it still holds water, still reflects their face when the light hits just right. When I was younger, I thought grief had an expiration date, that there would be a moment when I would feel done, as if healing was a destination you arrived at, closed the door behind, and never had to return. But grief has never honored my timelines. It comes like the wind, unannounced, unpredictable. I could be grocery shopping and a smell will remind me of her perfume. Or I'll hear laughter that sounds like his and my chest will tighten as if memory has hands. But I've learned not to fight it. I no longer scold my heart for missing them. Grief, I've come to see, is not the enemy of healing. It is the companion of love. It is the evidence that we were open, that we risked knowing someone so deeply that their absence now echoes through the silence. What a sacred ache that we were brave enough to love like that. In Buddhist teachings, there is a beautiful understanding that everything changes. Anicca, impermanence. It's not just about letting go of attachment, but learning to live with change as part of life's fabric. Even sorrow is not fixed. It softens, it breathes, it matures into something quieter. Grief at first was a storm that wrecked the shores of my life. Now it's a river, still flowing, but gentle, sometimes even still. And in that river I have found space to float. Some days I let the current carry me. I cry, I ache, I remember. But I don't sink. I've made peace with the fact that grief is not something I need to fix, just something I need to befriend. When the Buddha spoke of suffering, he never told us to erase it. He told us to understand it, to sit with it, like a guest at the table, like a teacher with lessons only the heart can absorb. And perhaps grief is one of the most profound teachers of all, because it humbles us. It softens the ego. It strips away everything we thought mattered and leaves us with the simplest truth. We love, we lose, we remember. I think of my grandmother often. She died decades ago, but her presence is not gone. It lives in my hands when I sew, in the way I say certain words, in how I light a candle on cold mornings. She's not in the ground. She's in the gestures that remain, in the quiet things that no one else notices but me. And so, if you're someone who still misses someone, who feels that pang at unexpected times, who wonders if it's strange to still cry after so many years, let me tell you something gently. You are not broken, you are faithful, and remembering is not weakness. It is devotion. Grief doesn't ask you to let go of love. It just asks you to learn a new way to hold it. And sometimes holding looks like silence, like lighting a stick of incense for no one else but them, like sitting beside an old tree and feeling them near, like closing your eyes and hearing their laughter echo in the marrow of your bones. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to defend the tears. They are sacred. They are prayers in liquid form. So if the grief still comes, welcome it. Let it wash through. Let it soften you. Let it remind you that you have known love deep enough to lose. And what a gift that is. And now I wonder, what would shift in your heart if you saw your grief not as a shadow to overcome, but as a garden you quietly tend, season by season, in memory of someone you still love? Quiet Truth 9. You already are what you've been looking for. There's a kind of ache that comes not from what's missing, but from the long chase for something that was never truly gone. I used to think I had to improve myself into worthiness, that if I just became more healed, more spiritual, more serene, I would finally earn peace. But peace isn't a prize for good behavior. It's the still water beneath the chaos we create trying to deserve it. So many of us carry this unspoken belief that we're not quite there yet, that we'll feel better once we achieve something: clarity, enlightenment, forgiveness, discipline, success. But what if the truth isn't in adding but in subtracting? What if the path isn't upward or outward but inward, gently peeling back what was never yours to carry? I've spent years collecting labels: mother, caregiver, spiritual seeker, good person. And behind each one was a story: how I should behave, how I should speak, how I should feel. I wore them like coats in summer, heavy, suffocating, until one day I stopped. I sat by the window, cup of tea in hand, and asked the question I had always avoided. What if I'm not broken? What if I'm just buried? In that stillness I felt it, a presence underneath the noise. Not a new self to become, but the old self I had forgotten. The one before shame, before performance, before I believed I had to earn love. The Buddha never told us to become anything. He pointed us back to what we already are: awareness. Not the thoughts or emotions that pass like weather, but the sky itself. Spacious, unmoved, kind. In the West, we often speak of finding yourself, as if the self is a treasure buried on some distant island. But Buddhist wisdom invites a different way, not finding but unveiling. The way you might gently wipe the dust from a mirror. The reflection was never gone, it was only obscured. So when you sit with your pain, with your aging hands, with the quiet hum of a house that's grown still, know this: you are not behind. You are not incomplete. You are not waiting for permission to be whole. You already are. The work now is soft work, soul work, the work of unlearning, of loosening the grip on false stories, of pausing long enough to hear the breath behind the breath, to feel the way your chest rises without effort, to realize you were never separate from the truth, only distracted. Sometimes I look at the trees, how they don't strive to be more tree. They just are. The oak does not compete with the pine. The lotus does not apologize for blooming slowly. What if we too allowed ourselves that kind of grace? Maybe spiritual growth isn't about rising above, but settling into the truth that beneath the masks, the noise, the proving, there is a soft, unwavering presence. Yours, always yours. So if you're tired of striving, perhaps it's not because you're failing, but because your soul is whispering that it's time to stop searching. To come home, not to a better version of yourself, but to the version that never needed fixing. And now I wonder, what would happen if you stopped chasing peace and sat quietly enough to realize it has been waiting inside you all along? Conclusion: the lantern you already hold. And now we arrive at the quiet edge of this journey, 9 truths, not plucked from sacred books, but from lived moments, cracked hearts, and silent rooms that taught more than any teacher ever could. Maybe you recognized yourself in these stories, or maybe you realized you've been carrying the questions for years without ever knowing their names. But here's the part no one tells you. The wisdom you've been seeking isn't out there. It isn't locked in temples or hidden in someone else's voice. It's curled up in the corner of your own soul, quiet, patient, waiting for you to notice. And now you have. This wasn't just a video. It was a mirror, a lantern, a return. And if something stirred in you, even just a little, then the journey has already begun. So I invite you to do one small thing before you go. Pause. Feel the space between breaths. Look out the window. Hold your tea with 2 hands. Ask gently, not urgently, what part of me is asking to be loved right now? Because that question might change everything. If this video spoke to you, there's more waiting, not noise, not motivation, but truth. Slow, soft, yours. Please consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. This is not the end, it's an invitation. And I'd love to walk this path with you. Drop a comment below. Which truth spoke to your heart the most? And until next time, may you be safe, may you be well, may you be at peace.